Today, we welcome to the program Melissa Peltier, who's an award-winning filmmaker and producer of the documentary The Game Is Up, Disillusioned Trump Voters Tell Their Stories. Melissa, really great having you on. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So, we've seen and even done interviews at Trump rallies with those who are not disillusioned. In other words, they still are Trump supporters. And it's interesting to ask them why they have not abandoned Donald Trump, given that, of course, just about every promise he made, he didn't keep. He made very clear that he only even really cares about these folks to the extent that they're useful to him. And then he no longer cares, all these things. So we've heard from the people that are sticking with him. Right. You did something interesting, which is you spoke to many disillusioned Trump voters to figure out why are they no longer sort of part of the cult, as it may be. Was there one coherent story about what ultimately drove them away, or was it really different things for different people?
It was different. There were a couple people who had pinpointed Helsinki with Trump and Putin as one trigger, but I mean, everyone kind of mentioned that, I think, all along, but everybody had a different reason because they all had different reasons for voting for him.
Oh, that's interesting. So in other words, the reasons, whatever originally attracted them to Trump was a factor in what ultimately dissuaded them.
Exactly.
Can you give a couple examples?
Well, off the top of my head, our farmer, Chris Gibbs, he was kind of laser focused on the agricultural aspect of it, which is, you have to remember that people often vote just for their own personal reasons, not just because they're a racist or they're whatever.
Yeah.
He was really laser focused on agriculture. He liked the idea that Trump was going to lift the waters of the U.S. rule. He didn't like Trump. He wasn't in love with him, but he voted for him because he didn't like Hillary. And he also felt that Trump was really kind of anti government on your property kind of thing. And so he voted for him, and he was impressed with some of the things he did in the beginning. And then he began to see what Trump's real agricultural policy was doing. And really, the trade wars just decimated the agriculture business. And nobody knows that, except the people who are decimated. Only a few of them, I think, with Trump like Chris, have gone away from Trump. But he was watching it very carefully. He had actually worked for the Department of Agriculture as a farm bill guy, and he just was disgusted with it. And then he kept hearing Trump lie and lie and lie, like saying that China's paying the tariffs. And he just broke. It was it. That was it.
The tariffs thing is interesting because it doesn't really seem that Donald Trump has ever understood how tariffs work. And of course, he insists China pays the tariffs. But really what happens is the United States puts a tariff on Chinese imports. And so whoever is buying the Chinese imports still pays China for the stuff, but then also pays a tariff to the United States government. Now, there's like macroeconomic stuff, which would indicate that over time, China would lower the prices in order to account for the tariff. Okay, but that's not the nuts and bolts of how the tariff works. In your experience, did Chris understand that all along, or did he come to know it after those tariffs were put in place, or how did he understand that?
Well, he first of all, he was very angry about also withdrawing from TPP.
Okay.
But with the tariffs, I think, he was smart enough to know what would happen.
Yep.
And I think he didn't know how long it might go on, but when it really, really dragged on and really started killing their business, because as he points out, it was actually farmers who negotiated those international agreements. Farmers had, their buyers, and they had been doing this over 30 years. And basically overnight, Trump wiped away their tried and true markets.
You speak in the film to a Jewish woman who was a Trump supporter, and then Charlottesville happened, and Trump made the fine people on both sides comments, which I am glad to admit were slightly taken out of context and were a little bit different than what was the original reporting. But needless to say, it still impacted this particular woman. Can you talk about that a little bit? And I mean, this is kind of a bigger trend wherein actual American Jews are one of the most left-wing voting blocs that there is. Recently, Trump has done this thing on Truth Social where he says, the American Jews should really shape up here because bad things could happen. You should be more appreciative. Talk about the Jewish woman you spoke to and how her views changed.
I haven't talked to her in a little bit. She's in college in Israel, but I think that she was a Brooklyn girl, and she was the head of the Brooklyn Young Republicans. In fact, she'd revived the club. And she was extremely Republican. She was really dedicated. She was very young when she got into it, but she was blowing people away with what she could do and what she knew. And she hung out with those Turning Point people and, all the young Charlie Kirk type Republicans.
Yep.
And she was a really, really a true believer in Trump. Absolutely. She worked, to help get him elected. She worked on Republican campaigns in New York. And she went to rallies. I mean, she talks about the rallies as being like a very unhealthy drug, where everybody sort of got even more in his thrall, the longer the rally, the longer they waited in line, in fact. And so she really was all in for him. And then she heard the Charlottesville comment, and it really upset her and disappointed her because of family who'd been killed in the Holocaust. And she was very aware of it. And she also was very upset by Charlottesville. And her parents actually were refuseniks who had escaped from Russia right around the time of perestroika. So they finally got out. Her mom's dad had been a dissident. So her mom was on the watch list just because of her dad. And so it took them a long time to get out. And they had told her whole life, she was born in the US. They had told her whole life that, this is what happens when you get this kind of extremism. This is what happens. This is what happens. And she started to see that happening. And then shortly after that, she saw Helsinki and Putin. And she started to get scared. And she started to realize this guy is dangerous. He's not what I thought he was. And I think, the very fine people on both sides comment. She was interviewed by a local news station who said, what did the Brooklyn Young Republicans think of that? And she said, well, we were all very disappointed. And she immediately gets a call from the head of the New York Republican Party saying, why did you say that? And she said, I just said we were disappointed. It's just how we felt. And he said, well, you can't say that. We're Republicans. You can't say anything bad about Trump. And that was another trigger for her with her parents, because, they told her how what you said was controlled and what you thought was controlled. And she just that really got to her. So it took her a little bit of time, but she finally realized she didn't care. She didn't want this guy.
You mentioned the rallies, and I've covered so many of these Trump rallies, and it is absolutely true that the lines to get in, even when there aren't that many people, the lines to get in are still crazy because of multiple layers of security. Sometimes they're held in really rural places that aren't actually equipped to handle the number of people that are going, all sorts of different reasons. Trump often runs, an hour or more late, and folks are sometimes there all day, Sandy cans, blazing sun, all the horrible conditions. In my mind, it's who would go through this in order to hear this guy give the exact same speech that he gives everywhere. The feedback you got is the long wait almost reinforced the cult.
Oh, yeah. There's a psychology to long waits. And it's one of the reasons sometimes artists on purpose will go out late. It makes you believe that, you've already thrown in, you've driven all the way there, you've gotten in line, you've gotten your tickets. Now you're waiting. Wow, this must be really important because I'm waiting so long. And it starts the value in your psychology of this event goes up. So it primes you to think, wow, we finally got in. This is it. It's like getting into a Rolling Stones concert. Right. And Joe Walsh's wife, Helene, said it was like a big rock music event.
One of the interesting things is that once the rally actually starts, we've seen so many times when Trump starts rambling, the crowd will look visibly bored. Sometimes they start filing out even during the speech. It's almost like it's just about Trump's there and he starts speaking, and then it becomes almost irrelevant what he says. They've been there for the event.
Right, right. I think that's a big part of it. And also, I remember reading an article, I think it was in the Post, about how tailgate parties and the people that you see at rallies become your friends, even though they live a state away. And so that there was a whole event part of it, like a
Yeah.
reunion of all these like-minded people who thought Trump was like the Messiah. And that was a big part of it too. And one of the things, again, Helene pointed out is that there's the same group of people who go from rally to rally to rally to rally.
Yes.
Yeah, you bring in locals or whatever, but he has a core group who come in buses and they go to all the rallies. It's like they go to every Grateful Dead concert, the same thing.
So evangelical support for Trump. This is something that in 2016 we saw, because there was a very big Republican primary of which Trump only had a very small slice to begin with. And as we all know now from the historical record, slowly but surely different people were sort of fell off and the support consolidated around Trump. The evangelical vote was initially very much not around Trump in the Republican primary. And when we think about why, it seems sort of obvious. Trump is a guy who was in favor of choice for 68 years and then had to come up with this story of why he became against abortion, not a church-going guy, married, divorced, cheating, all these different things. So it sort of made sense that he didn't have the evangelical support. Eventually, he got most of the evangelical support. And the way we look at it now is, well, they weren't going to vote for Hillary, and it's sort of like that simple. What more is there to the eventual evangelical support for Trump?
Well, how I understand it is that he promised them he would make sure, to appoint these anti-abortion judges.
Right.
And he leaders of the community. But the people we talked to, really, they were influenced by their pastors. A couple in Detroit had pastors who would tell them, from the pulpit who to vote for and who was evil, Hillary, evil. And then there was another evangelical that we profiled who is he's just a recently Liberty University graduate. That was going to be his first election. And he said basically at Liberty University, they did all but tell you where to make your mark. I mean, they basically, everything was pro-Trump. They had a rally for him there. It was flyers everywhere. It was the whole community being told, in essence, to do this. And evangelical Christians tend to be very sort of hierarchical in terms of we listen to our pastors, they're above us. And so pastors have a huge amount of power. And if they're preaching from the pulpit who to vote for or go to hell, or the woman who comes in is going to, prevent you from ever going to church again, which is one of the things they said, that, she was going to destroy the churches. Which is, of course, totally not backed up by anything. She was actually a pretty religious person. But I think, people hear it from their pastor. They want to hear a simple thing, yes, no, good, bad. And that's what they heard. And so that's how they voted. And they still believe that.
So you told us about the farmer who over agricultural policy bailed on Trump. You told us about the Jewish woman who over Charlottesville bailed on Trump. What are some of the other reasons people gave for, how did they feel betrayed by Trump, I guess?
Well, Joe Walsh, it was definitely Helsinki and Putin. But I actually got inspired to make this documentary by watching Joe Walsh in real time change over Twitter. Yeah. Because it was fascinating to watch him completely turn around over about a year and a half. And for him, it was Helsinki. And that was like his, as he describes, he was throwing things around the room. And because he really felt that was treason. That was his belief. But the evangelicals had different reasons. One of them was the Liberty University grad. He had lived all over the world with his parents, who were teachers internationally. They had taught in South Korea, they taught in Saudi Arabia. So he had a much more global perspective. And he really felt that what Trump was doing to the refugees, beyond just what he was doing to them, it was more the way he talked about them and the way he made them sound like a plague. And that really upset him, because having lived all over the world, he's seen all sorts of conditions. And he believed that his Christianity, made him need to love all those people and welcome them and try to help them, rather than demonize them. So that was what really turned him around. The other couple, the husband was a machinist, and he had only been a Christian for about 4 years. And he went to his pastor and said, I'm not sure I like this guy Trump. I don't feel very good about him. And the pastor said, yeah, but we need to get the judges in, and need to get some laws passed, and this is the best thing for Christianity. And he just said, okay, well, that's what I'll do then. And he describes leaving the voting booth just feeling dirty, just feeling wrong. Something was wrong. He didn't know what, but he pushed it to the back of his mind until a year or two later, he's sitting in the break room with one of his workers, and the worker, he's talking about Christianity and God to this worker. And the worker is like, I just don't see why I would want to be a Christian if you support such a terrible human being. And it was like a lightning bolt hit him.
Wow.
And he heard it. And that, when people change, when people leave cults, whatever, you never know what it is that's going to be the first crack in that bubble.
Yeah.
But once that crack happens, if enough more information gets through, gradually that can change people's mind. And for him, for Ron, this guy, this evangelical who was in our doc, he went home and he started looking in the scripture for himself. At this point, he's been a Christian long enough, and he really knows how to study it. He goes to Bible study 3 times a week, and he finds all sorts of passages that describe people like Trump being bad.
Right.
And he said, no, I'm done. I'm done with this guy.
The film is The Game Is Up. Disillusioned Trump voters tell their stories. We've been speaking with the filmmaker, Jo Peltier. Super interesting work, and I really appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thanks.